Hello and welcome to a special edition of the Tennessee Informer. I'm your host, Dave Vance. Tonight we have with us a very special guest. He is former FBI agent and whistleblower Steve Friend. He is the author of the book True Blue, in which Steve explains his decision to turn whistleblower and expose FBI politicization and abuse against conservative America. Steve Friend has his dream job as an FBI special agent. After nearly a decade of combating violent crime, human trafficking, and child predators, he was reassigned to the FBI's investigation of the Capitol unrest at the United States Capitol on January 6, 2021. He soon discovered efforts by the FBI and Department of Justice to manipulate statistics and exaggerate the nationwide threat of domestic terrorism. He spotlighted how the politicized FBI was cooking the books to support an ongoing narrative from the Biden administration to label Donald Trump voters as violent extremists. He witnessed overzealous practices to harass conservative Americans and realized the FBI was turning its investigative processes into a punishment. When the married father of two made his bombshell allegations in a whistleblower disclosure, leaders within the FBI exposed themselves as partisan, ambitious players who insisted the January 6 protesters killed police officers and attempted to seize American democracy. Hell-bent on suppressing Friend from exposing the truth, FBI officials seized his gun and badge and suspended him from working as a special agent. In his memoir, Friend reflects on the lessons and life experiences that led him to ultimately risk his career to uphold his FBI special agent oath to protect and defend the United States Constitution against all enemies, both foreign and domestic. He is now a senior fellow with the Citizens for Renewing America. And he is now in Tennessee as well, or working with people in Tennessee, attempting to get some good legislation passed here to prevent potential abuses by state law enforcement personnel working with federal agents. Steve, thanks for being with us today, especially on such short notice.
Oh, it's great to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to share the information with your audience.
Well, we're going to get right to it. The bill in question that you are helping to support is House Bill 2912 by Todd Warner, Senate Bill 2804 by Senator Joe Hensley. And I'm just going to read off the bill, and the audience can see it on the screen. Now, it was originally a caption bill, so this is the language that's going to be amended. Add the following section. An officer employed by a law enforcement agency within this state may participate in Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, criminal investigations, operations, and task force details, but only as permitted by this section. B, in the event a law enforcement agency within this state nominates personnel to be deputized as a federal task force officer, the nominee is limited to matters involving Title 18 and Title 21 of the United States Code and must only engage in relevant law enforcement activities pertaining to violations of criminal law. The nominee shall not assist the FBI in national security investigations or operations. Further, the nominee must not be a member of an FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force. This section does not prohibit the direct sharing of information for investigative purposes or participation in fusion centers. This act takes effect upon becoming law of the public welfare requiring it. Okay, so it's okay if they're involved with criminal task forces, but we don't want them involved with anti-terrorism task forces. And what's the reason for that, the Joint Terrorism Task Force?
Well, take a step back. What is a task force and what is a task force officer? I think it's worth sort of explaining because you kind of get into the weeds right away on it.
Right.
Now, the FBI has 14,000 agents around the country. It's impossible for them to do their job without cooperating with local law enforcement. So frequently what happens is they will essentially adopt deputies or police officers from local agencies. Those agencies will nominate those guys and they'll come over to the FBI, and the FBI will swear them in as federal task force officers. So they'll have arrest authorities federally in addition to their state arrest authorities. And they get assigned to these task forces that exist, that the FBI establishes in the offices. It could be a safe streets task force, which really deals with gangs, or a trans-organized criminal Western Hemisphere task force, which is dealing with drugs coming across the border. And then they have the Joint Terrorism Task Force, which really we saw happening after 9/11. And that is a focus on national security matters, domestic terrorism and international terrorism. The purpose of this bill is not to stop the local agencies or the state affirmed agencies within Tennessee from working with the FBI on terrorism matters. We're only prohibiting someone from becoming a task force officer on a joint terrorism task force. And that is really to empower the local magistrate, the local sheriff, as I can sort of explain. Because if you become a task force officer in a national security aspect on a, we'll call it the JTTF is really what it's, the initials are. If you are a task force officer, you get you have a security clearance. If you have a security clearance, you have to have a need to know. So essentially, if a deputy is working for the FBI can assign him to whatever they want, and he can't tell his sheriff about it. And as far as I am concerned, the people of Tennessee elect their sheriff. They don't elect the FBI, and the FBI is co-opting personnel who of their elected sheriff is supposed to have oversight of, and those folks are completely not responsive to him anymore.
Well, and the sheriff is supposed to be in your county. He is the highest constitutional officer in your county. So I don't know why any sheriff would really want to water the authority down any. I don't understand why he would want to. Why he would even give that power away.
There's a lot of goodies attached to it. If you get in with an FBI task force, they will pay for training and for equipment. The federal government will pay the overtime expenses of that task force. So it's they kind of rope these agencies in with golden handcuffs. But if you prohibit a deputy or a police officer from being on the task force, that doesn't mean that the agency itself can't work with the FBI on terrorism cases. It just means that the FBI will have to come to most likely the sheriff and say, look, we have a legitimate terrorist threat here. Well, can we partner on it with us? And it doesn't prohibit the sharing of information. The local deputy or the local police officer can bring information to the FBI. The FBI can disseminate information to those local agencies. The fusion centers, that's a Department of Homeland Security invention. Again, it's information sharing. We're not stopping anything from happening. We're just empowering the local sheriff to know what is going on from a national security perspective, as opposed to sort of putting a cone of silence around it. And really, I think that it's worth noting that we want to do this because the FBI has demonstrated how mission creep and politicization have really been driving the ship here on the Bureau for the last few years. And as a result of that, now the FBI is broadening its interpretation of its national security mandate. It's broadening the definition of actually what is terrorism. And it is sending these deputies and these police officers who become task force officers for the FBI to go and work on things that are not really terrorism cases, but they're just sort of checking the box for the FBI.
So before 9/11, before the era of the joint task force, did they utilize local law enforcement for whatever terrorist investigations they may have had in the past?
Absolutely. This is historically what they've done. I'm actually good friends with a gentleman who worked on task forces in the state of Connecticut, and they were a fugitive apprehension task force, and that would be using resources from the FBI and from local police departments. He was actually an investigator for the state's attorney. So they pull resources and personnel from all different agencies. That historically, that's what they do, and it's been an effective way to address whatever the task is at hand. The problem, though, when it comes to terrorism, particularly for the FBI, is how it's evolved. Now, 9/11 is really the point in time where the FBI received this mandate from the federal government, from the expectations of the American people, that the FBI is going to be the sentry on the wall to protect Americans from bad actors, from terrorist attacks. But there's not a lot of work for them to do. And there's a lot of money attached to it, and it's a bureaucracy. So they have to justify their existence, which is why in the early 2000s, we had this term emerge from the FBI called homegrown violent extremism. And that was defined as, it's not a terrorist over in Afghanistan who was plotting an attack. This was someone who lived in America, who was maybe a recent immigrant or was a first generation American, but their sympathies lay with someone in Afghanistan, with those organizations, with the Taliban, right, with ISIS, something to that effect. But as multiple studies have now shown, many of those individuals, the lion's share, actually, the broad majority of those individuals, were not predisposed to actually commit an act of terrorism. The FBI essentially entrapped them. They were just vulnerable people. The FBI then took that playbook and applied it to a different group of people, the next evolution. And that is, as we've been hearing in the last few years, domestic violent extremism. President Biden, speaking in front of Independence Hall, connected domestic violent extremism with Republican voters. He said they're white supremacists. And a subcategory of that, of domestic violent extremism, is racially motivated violent extremism. And now we're seeing the FBI put its top priority in counterterrorism as white supremacy. Meanwhile, you're twice as likely to be struck by and killed by a bolt of lightning in this country than killed by a white supremacist. And that's even counting all the violent crime that occurs within a prison context where you actually have lots of white supremacists that are cooped up together. And the final evolution, as we're now seeing come out, you will hear it now emerge. It was leaked to Newsweek a couple of months ago. It's a term that I'm aware of. It's been around for a couple of years. And the FBI has actually published a piece with the Department of Homeland Security on. And it is the term anti-government, anti-authority violent extremist. The acronym is AGAVE, AGAAVE. And AGAVE, according to the FBI, is someone who has a perception of government overreach or negligence or illegitimacy, which is very broad and really could be painted on a lot of people. But as a result of that, the FBI can then start an assessment process, start the process of finding a man and looking for a crime. And even as recently as the last few weeks, there's been a lot of debate over Christian nationalism. Now, the FBI has a caveat that they put on everything. It says the FBI does not investigate First Amendment protected activity like speech or worship, but there's a workaround for it. The workaround for the FBI is they will take these studies that are done by these think tanks that claim to be nonpartisan, but they're funded by like a Soros. Right. And they will say that Christian nationalism is in itself okay, but it's refracted through a lens of white supremacy, even though anyone who goes to church and says, I'm a Christian, if you're white, black, brown, green, blue, orange, you all hold the same beliefs. But the study will say that it's actually white supremacy that the beliefs are refracted through. And now the FBI has what it needs because they can say racially motivated violent extremism. They can say that going to an abortion clinic is domestic terrorism now. Because,
you mean protesting or something? Or praying?
Correct.
Even praying, as we saw.
They can say that it is some sort of hate crime, some sort of intimidation technique. They will broadly interpret it, and they will use the racial angle if they need to in order to do that. And if you have a racially motivated violent extremist, now you can employ your Joint Terrorism Task Force to go and investigate it. And that deputy, who's a task force officer on that task force, can't tell his sheriff about it, or he would actually be booted off the task force entirely. If we were to pass this bill, if the FBI wants to investigate someone who's praying outside of an abortion clinic as a terrorist and needs the assistance of the sheriff's department, they should go to the sheriff, right, get his approval.
Let's say somebody joined this task force, and then once they got involved, they realized, wow, these guys are out of control. And they saw something that they thought was wrong, they thought was a violation of our constitutional rights. And they wanted to back out of being a task force member. I imagine they could back out quick enough, but are they then, is there anything legally that would keep them from telling their sheriff, hey, this is what they're doing? Would they be subject, I would imagine they'd be subject to some sort of legal sanction if they did that, other than, just no longer being on the task force?
It would really be a question of how far the FBI wanted to take it. They would revoke their security clearance immediately, and then you could get into issues, like we've seen, where they're sharing national secrets with someone who doesn't have a need to know. I mean, there's a criminal angle to that. There's right. A national security reason for that. So they could be at risk in that way. I think, though, that aside from personal liability or accountability that someone could be in jeopardy from, the risk that a lot of agencies see is that they will become persona non grata to the FBI, and then they wouldn't be able to collect the goodies that the FBI brings, which is the way that they sort of keep them on the hook. And they say, look, we'll pay all your overtime. We'll give you guys these phones and these computers, and we'll send them to this fancy training. And that's really appealing to especially a lot of small departments and agencies because they don't have the resources for that. And as a result of that, there's hesitancy, which is why, from what I'm understanding, there's pushback from the Sheriff's Association in Tennessee. Even the Tennessee Bureau of Investigations has said that they get so much from the FBI that they don't want to back this bill, even though this will actually empower sheriffs and the TBI to know what is going on so that they can be really accountable to their constituents. And what it essentially boils down to is, if you are hesitant to pass this bill, which does nothing to limit the FBI or local agencies' ability to combat crime, to combat terrorism, it just makes it more direct line of communication with the chief law enforcement officer in each municipality and county, then you have to answer this question. What level of weaponization are you willing to abide or to suffer for, allow your citizens to suffer in return for the federal government paying your overtime? And if you were in a position of public trust, the answer should always be zero. And if it's not, then we have a greater problem that probably needs to be addressed outside of just an amendment to a Tennessee bill.
Yeah, well, let's keep in mind that in Tennessee, the Sheriff's Association, at least in the past, has regularly spoken out against pro-Second Amendment legislation. The TBI, they've done the same as well, and the director of the TBI, in reference to the question of allowing people to carry long guns like so many other states around us can, his response was, well, I guess if you want to carry a muzzle loader, that'd be okay, because that's what they had at the time when the Constitution was written. So we're not really dealing with entities that have demonstrated, to me at least, that they have a lot of respect for the Constitution that they're supposed to be upholding. I'm not really surprised. But, this whole money thing, and I hear this all the time. I bring this up with other legislators, because those golden shackles you mentioned, they come in different ways. And what I always hear is, well, if we don't spend it, somebody else will. But back to your point, if we accept it, we accept the shackles that come with it. And it's disgraceful to me that the Sheriff's Association or the TBI or even any sheriff's department that's willing to sacrifice the rights they're supposed to be upholding and defending, especially a county sheriff. A county sheriff is the highest constitutional officer in a county, for federal dollars. I mean, good Lord, and it's only going to get worse if we can't get these people to do the right thing.
Isn't only that they will take these people and co-opt them into the FBI and then keep them there for years, essentially merge them into the culture there, which was my experience with many of these task force officers. They'd been going directly to the FBI office, not to their sheriff's department or the police department, for years on end. And just through a process of osmosis, it's going to be impossible to stop this rotten culture that we've seen on full display for the last few years. Look, I'm not on the inside of the FBI anymore. I'm on the outside. I still have lots of context on the inside. So I have my moles and they give me things, which is why me and my cohorts, we call ourselves the suspendables. We were all suspended for becoming whistleblowers. We've been able to expose a lot, even from the outside. And from what we're learning, all of the new agents who are going to the FBI Academy at Quantico right now are being fully indoctrinated that the only thing the FBI is focused in on is white supremacy. So it's clearly politically driven, and there needs to be a sheriff or a local law enforcement officer who will stand in the gap against that. This is a shot across the bow, not necessarily to hurt the FBI's ability to do what is objectively good, and that is to apprehend criminals, to investigate properly, but it is to reorient it to go after what should be their priorities, and that would be serious risks in national security, and those risks should be brought to the attention of a sheriff,
right? Not
just a task force guy on loan.
So when that guy becomes a task force member, so is it not for a certain amount of time? Is it just open-ended?
It really is. Depends on the agency. A lot of agencies like to sort of share that experience with lots of members. So it'll be for 18 months, or it could be a 5-year limit or something to that effect. And then they pull them back. But really, it could be forever. as long as they're gone. And as long as the overtime is being paid for, a lot of agencies are just kind of content. They have someone there. They view it as an opportunity to have direct contact with the FBI. But really, it's not a two-way street. For the most part, the FBI is benefiting far more than the locality when it comes to that, because the FBI, the federal government, they can print the money that they wind up paying the overtime. They're not out anything when it comes to that. But what they do get is the personnel, the local knowledge. They know the usual suspects, because the 14,000 agents, it's impossible to police an entire country. So in my office that I have in Daytona Beach, there were 8 special agents. Our area was 4 counties in the state of Florida. There were 1 million people that live in those 4 counties. It's impossible for 8 people to police. So we leaned on and relied on task force officers to come in, because they're not guys that are just out of the police academy. These are guys that graduated police academy, rode a beat, demonstrated their ability to be a great police officer, became a detective, spent some time in a detective's office. They know actually how to do an investigation. They don't have to be taught. It's not the job of the FBI to teach you how to be an investigator. If you're a task force officer, you're supposed to bring those skills in. And it's not unusual for the most experienced and the highest level investigator on a task force to be someone who's not actually an FBI employee. It's a Joint Terrorism Task Force officer who brings all of that to the FBI. And then I'll say this, the FBI at this point has demonstrated that we don't see the press conferences anymore where they have the big bust, right? Where they have the Pablo Escobar drug case with stacks of cocaine and money and drugs they get. All the FBI is doing now is clout chasing with empty indictments of people who they're never actually going to arrest. Like they indicted a couple of Russians for war crimes. Well, they don't know the Russians' names, but they indicted them anyway. It's just chasing a headline.
How do you do that? How do you indict somebody without a name?
They know their first name. They know his name was like Vladimir.
Vladimir, right?
Last name unknown. And then the second way that they get clout and they get attention is they go and adopt local cases. So more often than not, you'll see some headline that the FBI says it'll be a serial armed robber was apprehended and convicted by the FBI. Well, you read the press statement and it'll say, yeah, he robbed a Lowe's hardware store for a $500 air conditioner and was apprehended immediately by local police. But the FBI saw that and said, well, that air conditioner crossed state lines, so we'll just take that. It's a ground ball. We'll be able to get our headline, take it off the locals after it's kind of all sewn up with a bow on top, and we'll take credit for it, which is what mostly that they do at this point.
This is insane. I got a couple quick questions here on this. Okay, just to clarify, so when they become a task force officer, you said that they're, the amount of time varies, but day to day, if they're not involved with an active task force investigation, then they're working back at their regular job, correct? And if they are involved with the task force, they're totally dedicated to whatever the task force is working on. Is that the way that works?
If you are a task force officer on the JTTF and there's no terrorism work to do, you just sit there idly. You might make yourself available to do other things that are administrative and help where you can on one thing or another. But I will tell you, where we were in Daytona Beach, all of our cases that we had were January 6 cases that were just sitting in Washington, D.C. with nothing to do. And so between the 4 of us on the task force, we had about 15 minutes of work to do. So don't take a long lunch, make sure you go to get a workout in, and then hit the door at about 4 p.m.
Okay, so what you're telling me is that with the FBI, at least with the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and it probably works that way with the others, but on this issue, because that's the main thing we're concerned with, that the only way that the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force can undermine the rights and our constitutional rights and freedoms in the states is with complicity of the local sheriffs if they are allowing their guys to be on this Joint Terrorism Task Force. Or that's the most likely way, because like you said, you've only got so many bodies. And if you didn't have the use of the local personnel for your task force, you really wouldn't be very effective at doing anything, correct?
Without a question, the local personnel who are adopted by the FBI in the form of a task force officer, they're a force multiplier. There's more of them than there are agents a lot of times. And as a result of that, yes, you would have some level of what the FBI is doing. I would characterize it as persecution, as weaponization, as abuse,
Right.
but it would be limited. And the other factor that we should take in, and your audience should know, is the FBI has a quota system. And in order to hit their quota, they have to go where things are fertile. And when I say fertile, I mean a cooperative local agency that they can adopt cases from. Now, if you were to not be as cooperative with them and harden your area and then insist on the FBI actually working directly with the sheriff who's elected by the people, where he can actually incentivize them to do what his constituents need them to do, and that is to bring crime down as opposed to bring it up, which is what the FBI wants to do. They want to bring the numbers up so they can justify their existence. That is a way to sort of course correct what we were seeing with the FBI, where they're completely beholden to this quota, and they will manipulate statistics. They will go after and target individuals who have nothing to do with what they're alleging. Look, personal experience. I was told to open an ISIS case on someone who had no connection to ISIS because we didn't have an ISIS case and the quota said we had to have one. It happens every single day.
Wow. So cooperation is complicity to a great degree in terms of abusing our rights.
It is complicity, but we need to make sure that we're very clear about this. You are able to achieve the true mission, which is to combat crime and to counter terrorism without sending task force officers to the FBI. Have them work directly with the chief law enforcement officer, and then he can assign his people to assist in any way that's necessary. But most of all, it's just making sure that the FBI has to come to the lead guy who's most accountable to his constituents.
But you won't have that you won't know what's going on if you send your guy to be part of the task force. That sheriff will then be in the dark on what's going on, right?
Theoretically, the sheriff could make a phone call to his deputy and say, hey, what you working on over there? And the deputy would be compelled, because of his agreement with the national security, to have a security clearance. He would have to say, sheriff, you don't have a need to know. I can't tell you.
Wow. And of course, when you have a clearance, even, the information, until that information is declassified, even though if you were to get out of the task force, if that information is still classified, you can't go talking about it just because you're no longer in the task force, because then you could get in trouble.
That's correct. I mean, I'm friends with someone who worked as an intelligence analyst for the Marine Corps, the United States Navy, the NSA, and the FBI. So we're talking 4 decades in intelligence. And when he retired, he no longer has a security clearance because he doesn't have a need to know. He can't tell me about it. He has to talk very vague terms about things that he did because he has to respect that. And as a result of that, even if you were to leave, you would be in violation of that. If you were to come clean, you could be in personal jeopardy, which again is if you want to do the right thing, there shouldn't be you shouldn't be in personal jeopardy for that. So even the guys who are task force officers that see malfeasance and wrongdoing and weaponization coming forward, they're putting their own careers and possibly their freedom at risk, because the FBI comes at you pretty hard, as I can personally testify to.
I'm sure. Okay. So you mentioned the overtime pay. Who are they paying overtime for? Is it just this task force officer?
Yes. Yeah, all the personnel that come over, they pay them, and they definitely earn it, because the FBI, if they have a warm body there and there's something that can be done for them and they don't care about the dollars and cents of it, that's how you get guys who are on a terrorism task force that are sitting on a drug wiretap. Well, they're signing up because it's basically unlimited overtime for them, and why shouldn't they personally benefit from it? Where the agents are on salary, they're not getting overtime. The task force guys love it. They're collecting. If something needs to be done, the task force guys are always the first to jump to it because they get compensated for it. But again, we're back to the federal government is paying it, but the federal government can just print the money. So they're not out anything. This is why these local agencies jump on that because they're constricted by their finances and the federal government's not, and that's how they're able to buy their compliance.
Okay, so, but unless there's actually an issue in that area, in that sheriff's jurisdiction, what's the bang for the buck for him?
And that's an excellent point. I mean, look back to my own example, 4 counties. So let's say we had a deputy from each one of those counties on a task force and myself. So 5 of us. And there's a case we're investigating in County A. Well, deputies from County B, C, and D are not working in their counties in their respective areas. They're not doing anything. We're all working and focusing on County A. And the idea is that we're going to bring our own knowledge and resources to address that threat, and eventually we'll get over to County B and County C and County D. But it really just winds up being whatever the priorities of the FBI are, not necessarily where the geographical area is, but where they deem to be a threat. And as I've explained, they're broadly interpreting what constitutes a threat now, and it's very politically motivated.
You mentioned earlier about they are now describing Christian nationalism as white supremacy, or I think maybe just in general they're describing Christianity as white supremacy. Is that accurate, that they are to some degree describing it that way?
They are, and it's not new. Well, just brief history lesson. We go back a year, and we had the revelation of this intelligence report from FBI Richmond field office about radical traditional Catholics, and all of the literature and research and reporting that was used, that was very biased, that was used to generate that report, came from Salon and the Atlantic and the Southern Poverty Law Center. But all of those resources said that this was white Christian nationalism linked. And because it was brought to light by a friend of mine, it kind of went back under the rug. Well, now they're starting to reemerge it. They're not calling it white Christian nationalism. They're calling it Christian nationalism. And the term doesn't matter. I know people get spun up about it, and a lot of people think, oh, I'm going to lean into that, and I'm really going to own them on this. The term doesn't matter. They can call you a scuba diver. They can call you a ventriloquist dummy. It does not matter. What they're going to do is take a study like they did for the radical traditional Catholic memo, and it'll be from the Public Religion Research Institute. Right? That is Soros funded. They have a connection with the Brookings Institution and the Atlantic and United Unitarians and all these far left organizations. And they'll come out and they'll commission a study, and the study will say that the 30% of Americans are Christian nationalists. Well, what's a Christian nationalism? Well, even though across racial lines there's a lot of agreement and there's no animosity between the racial groups, it's all refracted through white supremacy. And then there's also a tie to, we're seeing a correlation between people who are Christian nationalists and white supremacists and people who vote Republican. Well, now the FBI has the quote unquote nonpartisan literature and study, which will be reported in the news and talked about on TV. And they'll take all of that, collect it, and intelligence analysts will generate a bulletin or maybe a full report and suggest that, well, we better send some informants into these parishes to go investigate these people and see if maybe they're becoming anti-government extremists. Because not because of their First Amendment protected activity like worshiping on Sunday, but because they hold other beliefs that make them primed to become anti-government radicals. And if you go to the radical traditional Catholic memo, what made those, according to this intelligence analyst, what made people primed to become anti-government extremists were beliefs like being pro-life, pro-traditional marriage, pro-border sovereignty, and pro-Second Amendment, none of which are illegal. But they said just merely holding those beliefs kind of edges you towards becoming radicalized. And then what the FBI does is they will find a person. And that's when they will do things like introduce an informant or an undercover. And the person that they find, most of the time, as I talked about before with the homegrown violent extremist, that's a vulnerable person. There's actually a growing trend now in the FBI because we live and exist in this online digital world of FBI undercovers or informants going online, seeking out emotionally disturbed people, particularly autistic people, particularly minors, and then provoking them because of their proclivities become obsessive. And the undercover will say, oh, don't you like ISIS? ISIS is really good. Don't you think you like ISIS? You know, you should probably do. You should probably send them some money. And they will provoke them and push them, sometimes for years, until they actually go from being 16 years old to 18. And then when they're 18 years old in one day, the FBI bangs down their door and said, you provided material support to ISIS, you're under arrest. The same tactic has been used for decades, and it will be used against people who just claim to be Christian nationalists because they think they need to lean into that term.
What now? Have they ever been caught up in the whole entrapment deal? I mean, that sounds like entrapment to me. Or how are they working around that?
It is entrapment in spirit, but not in law. The law for entrapment is contrary to what somebody with just a general understanding and a moral sentiment would think of entrapment. That's called a sting. A sting says you can use undercovers, you can use informants, you can have those people lie to your target. They just have to have a predisposition, a willingness to want to engage in the activity, and they're given an opportunity to back out at some point. But if you've been talking to somebody for 2 years, you can overlook any time that they want to back out of it, or the actual amount of interest that they have in it. But if you keep hammering someone over and over and over again, and then you eventually hand them a bomb and say, "This is the bomb you wanted, right? Are you sure about that?" At that point, they're basically done. And if they can't even get that done, this was reported on in The Intercept by a case out in California relatively recently. A young man there who was a United States Marine, eventually a Marine reservist, autistic, interacted online. The FBI used this strategy. They used an undercover and an informant. Even though he lived in California, the undercover was an NYPD officer in New York, which I don't know why you're investigating someone in California, and the FBI informant was from somewhere down in the Southeast. And the NYPD undercover flew to California and met with him and encouraged him. And then eventually when the FBI came knocking, they said, "Hey, do you know anyone who's trying to have contact with a terrorist organization?" And this guy thought, "No, I don't know anybody. I'm going to protect my buddy. I'm not going to tell the FBI anything." Well, now he's lied to a federal agent. So even though they wind up dropping all the terrorism charges, they said, "You lied to us," even though you were lying about someone who really wasn't your friend and who actually wasn't going to talk to a terrorist organization. You didn't know that though. So we're going to charge you with terrorism or with lying to a federal agent, which is what they did. And his name's Jason Fong. And he's going to be going to prison for like 3 or 4 years now.
Wow. Now, you mentioned ISIS, and I don't doubt, I've thought for some time that some of these cases that the FBI cracked just a little too soon. Now, I'll just tell you straight up front, I don't trust any of the Islamic movements. I just do not trust Islamists, okay? If you read their doctrine, and I'm speaking for myself, their doctrine is incompatible with our Constitution. So you mentioned ISIS, you mentioned some of the others. It just blows my mind. Their doctrine is clearly hostile to our Constitution. I mean, if you read it, it is, and apparently that's not something I think that they've pushed in the FBI for quite some time. But unlike, there's nothing in Christian doctrine that would justify terrorist attacks. Okay, there's nothing in Christian doctrine that justifies using terrorism. Okay, but there is plenty in Islamic doctrine that justifies that. But I don't remember the FBI, or even when I was in the military, I don't remember the military really saying, "Hey, look, you guys got to understand, this is part of their culture." But then they take something like Christianity does not have the tendency to inspire acts of terror. And as a matter of fact, that's you have to ignore what's in the Bible to do those kind of things. And now they're going to say that they are a threat. That just, especially here in Tennessee, we've had some issues in Tennessee. We had the shooting in Chattanooga several years back. We had the Carlos Bledsoe situation. We have a very active Islamic community in our state, which is, they're big supporters of the BDS movement, and just promoting all that garbage. Although our governor doesn't mind being photographed with them, but all the same, it just blows my mind that our federal government would allow them so much leeway to bring so many of them here, and yet when it comes to Christians, oh, wow, they're a Christian, we're really going to have to watch them. We can legitimize in our mind investigating them. So,
At the FBI Academy, we were shown a video that was produced by the Southern Poverty Law Center in which they ranked people who oppose abortion, pro-life activists, as a greater threat than Islamists. That's the training that went on for me, and that was in 2014. So 10 years ago. I don't know if they still show that. But that was what we were shown. And I think that it's also worth knowing that back to the words. I said, Christian nationalist. The term doesn't matter. The FBI reinterprets what terms mean all the time to push a political agenda, which is why we'll take something like January 6th, where they departed from the rules on that, which is what I was a whistleblower about, where that's one case investigated with however many subjects committed or alleged to have committed a crime. The FBI opened a separate case for every single person. So now we've turned one case into thousands of cases. Wow. And then instead of investigating them on paper from Washington, D.C., there's a task force in D.C. that's doing the investigating. They assign them to the field, though. So in Daytona, where I was, it now looks like there's a domestic terrorist in Daytona Beach when it's someone who walks through the Capitol. Another manipulation, though, is most of those cases are riot investigations, according to the way that they are categorized by the FBI. Rioting is a criminal violation. It's not a counterterrorism matter.
Right.
But the FBI is saying that they are. They're calling them that so they can call them terrorist cases. So again, we're seeing that it doesn't matter what the term is. They will do whatever they have to and interpret the words any way they can to call things domestic terrorism, because the demand for domestic terrorism vastly outstrips the supply that we have in this country, which theoretically should be a good thing. And you should be addressing greater priorities like, I don't know, we're going to have 10 million people flood across the border in the last few years. Yeah. If 1% of 1% of them are bad actors, so 99.9% are good, that leaves 10,000 bad actors.
That's a lot of bad actors.
It took 19 to kill 2,997 people on September 11th.
When you guys received your training in 2014 and they were using the Southern Poverty Law Center, which there should have been an objection right there to them using that, but they tried to make the claim that pro-lifers were more of a threat than any Islamist group. Did that face anybody? Did anybody speak up and say, hey, wait a minute, where is this coming from? Or did they just, hey, well, we're in class mode here. We're just going to take what they say and assume it's true? What was the reaction, if any?
I think when you're at the academy for the FBI, a lot of people are a little bit older. Now the FBI is actually recruiting young people so they can indoctrinate them further. But when I was there, it was latter 20s, early 30s, people who were professionals. And there was some eye rolling because typically amongst agents, probably very different now, but by the time I was there, it tends to be a little bit leans more conservative, more libertarian. It's gun culture. Someone who's willing to carry a gun typically is going to support the Second Amendment. Typically, that's going to be conservative. I think there was a lot of, I remember rolling my eyes and talking about it with other people and just saying, this is not serious, but let's just get through this academy. It's almost like being at a woke college lecture and we'll just get to the field. But then when you get to the field, as was my experience, and I spent my first 7 years in the Midwest, so that was completely isolated and didn't have any politics going on there. When I then relocated to Florida, I was supposed to be working child pornography. The FBI took me off of those cases and said that they were not a priority, that they were a local matter only, that I needed to focus on domestic terrorism. That was the priority now. So they took me off of righteous child pornography cases and righteous human trafficking cases and put me on that. And then at one point, this was after the Jackson-Dobbs decision was leaked, and there was a lot of uproar and threats to the Supreme Court justices. I reached out. There was 2 crisis pregnancy centers in our area. And I reached out to the management there and thought, this would be a great opportunity to have a liaison effort because they could be at risk of a domestic terrorist, a threat. And they also could be a really good resource for human trafficking victims who come in there seeking help. And no one had ever come up with that idea. And I went and I connected with these individuals and then reported up the chain of command, gave me a little bit of a helmet sticker. They said, really good job. But what we really need you to focus in on now are abortion clinics. They are the priority. They're the ones that are going to be really at risk. And I live in Florida. And my response to them was the only people that win and then burn their own towns down are Lakers fans. So you want me to go and outreach to institutions that will be defunct in our state as soon as this decision comes out. I don't think that they're at risk. I think you're confused about that. But We have politically motivated executives in the FBI who are driving a lot of this forward. And those who are not even politically motivated, they're careerists. They're going to just follow orders, keep their head down, or they're financially enriching themselves, which is back to the quota system. The FBI's quota system is tied to the compensation for senior executives in the FBI. So ginning up additional domestic terrorism cases that are farcical is padding their pockets. And we're talking $50,000 a year that they get because the quotas are met.
Wow.
So this is the point. Is this the organization that a locally elected sheriff wants to send his people to be co-opted by and not responsive and accountable to him anymore? Is this the organization that elected representatives and senators in the state of Tennessee think, well, we can deal with that to a certain extent as long as they're willing to pay the overtime for some of our sheriff's deputies? Is this something that the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation says, yeah, we can work with them because they just bring us so many goodies? Again, if you were in a position of public trust, if you've raised your hand and sworn an oath to protect your state constitution, to protect the federal constitution, the stakes are higher. You should never be in that for personal enrichment or even for expansion of your agency's capabilities financially. That's wholly inappropriate and insufficient.
Absolutely. So the objection, now what I read earlier was the amendment. So just so everybody understands, this amendment, and if we could put it back up on the screen, this amendment is going to be in the Senate committee this Tuesday. I'm not sure where it's at in the House, but this is the Senate committee, and you can basically it just limits the Joint Terrorism Task Force. It is asking them not to, or it would direct them not to join the Joint Terrorism Task Force because that undercuts the authority and the knowledge of the sheriff, who will be out of the loop. And all these abuses that have been mentioned, that's facilitated when the sheriff doesn't know what's going on. So I don't know why any sheriff would even want to take part in this. And you said the overtime, and I know that was the argument that was being made before this amendment was presented. And the amendment, it's not going to show up on the state website yet because they haven't voted on it, because they got to vote on it in committee Tuesday. But this answers their concerns. Number one, it only applies to this issue, and they can still cooperate through the sheriff with them on the Joint Task Force for Anti-Terrorism. They just don't want to have a task force officer on there that would really undercut the sheriff's ability to make sure that the constitutional protections and rights in his county are being followed, are being respected. And you mentioned the overtime. They don't want to lose the overtime pay, but it sounds to me like that overtime pay, it's not like they're paying them overtime pay to work necessarily on local issues. I don't understand that. And it does nothing to prevent them from working on with the joint, getting information from the JTF or using the Fusion Center. They can still have information. It's not as if, okay, if we don't participate, we're barred from getting any information, correct?
No, not at all. The Fusion Centers are a great resource. That's a way that different agencies from around the area can share information with each other. I think if it becomes a concern about having a security clearance and a need to know if the FBI is working on a top secret terrorism case and they're worried about that, well, why don't we give the clearance to the sheriff? And then the sheriff can find out what's going on. And if they need his assistance and they need his personnel and resources and local know-how, go to him. And then if he needs to have some more people brought into the fold, some of his deputies, there's no reason why he can't do that. This is not stopping local agencies from working on terrorism cases with the FBI. All it's doing is saying that you cannot loan your person out who will no longer be accountable to the person that Tennesseans elected.
Absolutely. And if we could put the last slide with that bill back up there, because I want to look and want everybody to see the committee that it's in. I think it's the Senate. Yeah, Senate Judiciary tomorrow, Senate Judiciary on Tuesday. So if you look up the Senate Judiciary Committee members and give them a call and tell them to support House Bill 2912/SB 2804, and specifically ask them to support this amendment. I don't know the amendment number yet, but that will be presented to Tuesday when they vote on it. So guys, this is important. I mean, we have an opportunity here to be heard by our law enforcement that, hey, if cooperating with the federal government, the FBI and others, by having people assigned to their task force, if that's going to undermine our rights, especially since nobody in their right mind still trusts the FBI. I mean, if you still trust the FBI, you need to get yourself checked out. Bottom line, they are not there doing the right thing anymore. So, and I think they've made that pretty clear. Hey, once again, I thank you for coming on, especially on such short notice. But very important stuff you're working on, and we appreciate what you do. Yeah. Anyway.
Hey, it's my pleasure. My pleasure. I'm glad to share the information. And folks, make sure you call your reps, call your senators, and call your sheriff. We need the Sheriff's Association to get behind this. I think it would go a long way. Even if they need to depart from what the Sheriff's Association, if they wind up opposing, I think it helps to have an outspoken chief lawman out there saying that this is the right thing to do. Let's empower the guy who you voted for.
Yeah. Well, hey guys, make those calls. It's really important. I've got a few other bills that I want to go over real quick for everybody that are also going to be on tap for Tuesday and or Wednesday. I'll go ahead and we'll pop those up on the screen here, and you can make calls on them. HJR 0005, this is for the Convention of the States for term limits. This is in committee in Tuesday, the Senate State and Local Government Committee. Guys, I know a lot of people that are involved with the Convention of the States movement. Most of them, at least in Tennessee, are well-intentioned. It's dangerous, guys. You cannot control a convention once it's opened up. You just flat out can't control it. And so, well-intentioned, but this one needs to be defeated, in my opinion. And then we have some more bills as well. We've got SJR 0904. This is a constitutional amendment for Article 1, Section 26 of the Constitution of Tennessee to remove the provision that authorizes the legislature to regulate the wearing of arms with a view to prevent crime and states that citizens have a right to keep and bear arms for their defense. Now remember, they changed originally it was just you had the right to keep and bear arms. They changed this back in 1870. The thought is that they wanted to have something to fall back on so they could prevent the recently freed slaves from being able to arm themselves. In any event, especially after the Brewing case, we need to remove the restrictions on our ability to defend ourselves. If you look at what's going on the border, we need the ability to defend ourselves. And we also have the next bill up is House Bill 0694 by Fritz and Senate Bill 0574 by Senator Pody. This will be in the State Government Committee tomorrow. The House State Government Bill. Essentially, if you remember back during the COVID crisis, we had Governor Lee determined that certain occupations were non-essential, and this bill would prevent the governor or any state agency from declaring lawful occupations as non-essential. So I think that bill needs to pass as well. That's both in the House and Senate committees on Tuesday. And let me see, I don't think I've got, okay, all right, I think that, there is one other, I do want to point this out, and I don't think I have it on the slide. Okay, but I'm going to let you know about it anyway. House Bill 2000, and it's not slated for a committee, but there's a House and a Senate version. The Senate sponsor is Rose. I can't recall who the House sponsor is. But this bill would allow the AG to set his own pay and set the pay of the people that work for him. Now, within limits, it's not open-ended, okay? It's not any amount he wants. The fiscal note that I saw looked like it would add about $50,000 to the budget. So we're not talking a huge amount. I think it currently said he makes about $219,000. It'll allow him to go up to $260-some thousand. But I'm just curious, how many, I've never heard of a state agency or the head of a state agency being allowed to increase his own pay, or even be the one that makes the determination what the people below him make. I would have thought that would have been for a finance committee or somebody else to determine. So maybe somebody knows something about this that I don't, but House Bill 2000, look it up and ask your rep about it, ask your senator about it, ask them why we're going to allow the AG or why we would allow anybody, a public official like that, to set their own pay. There's something that just does not seem right there. So please look into that. I can't cover everything effectively in terms of all the upcoming bills. Any kind of Second Amendment bill, I recommend Tennessee Firearms Association. Any type of other issues related to that run the gamut from other things we've talked about, I recommend Tennessee Eagle Forum or TennesseeStands.org. Obviously, anything having to do with nullification, which that bill, of course, is being sent to summer study. We're not through with that. We are not quitting on that. I think Senator Bowling is going to make sure we actually get a hearing in summer study, and we're going to do what we can to educate the public and the legislators on that issue between now and next session. But tncssweebly.com, that's for information, and we're working on potentially having a debate by the author of the legislation and somebody who opposes that legislation. So if we get more details on that, I'll pass it on to you. I want to thank everybody for taking the time to watch our program. Please be sure to hit the like button and subscribe button as well as notification bell to stay informed about our upcoming shows. As a reminder, you can now listen to us as a podcast on Spreaker.com. You can find all the audio-only podcasts on your favorite episodes on our website, tninformer.com, or do a search for the Tennessee Informer on Spreaker.com. We're excited to announce the Tennessee Informer podcasts are available to listen to on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, and several other platforms. Take a moment to check out and follow our Facebook page at Tennessee Informer. We'll be posting news and information about upcoming shows on there as well as on our website. You can sign up for a weekly newsletter on our website, tinformer.com. We're also on Twitter at twitter.com/tininformer. Share us with your friends so they can stay up to date on what's going on in our state. Don't miss our upcoming episode next Tuesday as we deep dive into the release of the new movie Civil War and the unsettling parallels with our. Join us as we welcome our guest and subject matter expert, Rick Revel, who will shed light on the grim realities of actually living through a civil war. Get ready for a thought-provoking discussion on the challenges, horrors, and lessons of history that resonate with our modern world. Tune in for insights that could leave you questioning the direction of our country. Hope to see you there. That's it for now. Good night from Paris, Tennessee, that is.